This is where they die! On these shields, boys!
Let's talk about a complex topic, one that is sensitive but absolutely necessary to discuss. Why do men seem more prone to violence, yet are often the ones who suffer most from it? The goal here isn't to make excuses for anyone, or to paint men as victims, but to understand the why behind the behavior. Because what many men are missing is precisely that. Someone who tries to understand them, not just correct them. So, I dug into the most reliable statistics I could find from official European sources to get a clearer picture of men, women, and violence. It's important to know that the data doesn't always allow for a simple who commits more crime comparison. Because the types of crimes and how they're reported differ, but when we look at serious crimes, the evidence is overwhelming. Perpetrators are predominantly men. For example, a 2015 EU report showed that for sexual violence offenses, about 96.5% of those convicted were men. In some national surveys on interpersonal violence, the numbers are just as stark. The data suggests that men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of many of the most serious crimes, like homicide, sexual violence, and other forms of assault. So, who are the victims of these crimes? Well, it depends on the context. When we look at homicides in general, things like street crime or conflicts between strangers, men are far more likely to be the victims. However, when we zoom in on homicides committed by a partner or family member, the script flips dramatically. Women become the disproportionate victims. For instance, a 2023 Eurostat report showed that the rate of female victims of intentional homicide by a family member or partner was nearly double the rate for men. These crime statistics for homicide don't include deaths from war or military operations. Intentional homicide in these reports refers to civilian crime. If we were to include deaths in combat, the number of men killed by human violence would skyrocket. Historically and today, over 95% of combat fatalities are men. So, the clean civilian data actually underestimates the total violence that men experience. So in general, men are murdered more often, but within the home, women are at far greater risk. And what about violence in relationships? Here, the data is consistent and clear. Women in the EU are much more likely to be victims of violence from an intimate partner, as well as sexual or physical violence from non-partners. A major EU survey found that about 1 in 3 women has experienced physical or sexual violence in their adult lives. So when it comes to domestic and relationship violence, women suffer significantly more. So we have this paradox. Men kill more and die more in general violent contexts, women more in domestic or sexual contexts. This interpretation is largely correct, but there are important nuances. The idea that men are the more violent sex holds up statistically. Men commit the vast majority of violent crimes, typically between 85% and 95% of those recorded. Of course, this doesn't mean being a man equals being violent. It means that violent behavior, for a variety of reasons we'll explore, is more concentrated among the male population, especially in contexts like crime, war, and fights between strangers. But why do we see these statistics? The numbers show men are more prone to violent behavior, but the explanation isn't simple. It's not just nature. First, let's talk about biology. Yes, testosterone plays a role, but it's not the lone villain. Men have about 10 to 20 times more testosterone than women. This hormone can increase impulsivity and the drive for status. And in certain situations, like when feeling threatened or frustrated, it can amplify aggression. But context is everything. Social norms and self-control can strongly moderate this effect. A man with high testosterone in a stable, disciplined environment isn't necessarily more violent. But in a context of social exclusion and instability, that same hormonal profile might express itself as aggression. Essentially, testosterone might prepare the body to compete, but culture decides if that turns into ambition or violence. There are also subtle neurological differences. Studies have shown that during provocative situations, men's brains can show a stronger response in the amygdala, the threat detector, and less activation in the part of the brain that controls impulses. This can translate to a more reactive physical response to anger. From an evolutionary perspective, for thousands of years, males competed for resources and mates. The ability to intimidate, fight, and protect had an adaptive value. These favored traits like risk-taking and aggression. Females, on the other hand, had an evolutionary advantage in behaviors that favored cooperation and social stability, which helped protect their offspring. We live in complex modern societies now, but that evolutionary blueprint still influences our behavior, even if it's heavily shaped by culture. And that brings us to socialization, which is just as important as biology. From a young age, boys are often encouraged to be assertive, to compete, and not to show vulnerability. Crying is for girls, right? In some environments, boys learn that strength equals respect, which just reinforces the cycle. Girls, meanwhile, are often socialist toward empathy and emotional expression. Add to this structural factors, men are more likely to be in higher-risk professions and situations, from the military and police to construction sites and street life. The realistic conclusion is this: men may have a greater biological predisposition to aggression and risk, but this is amplified by cultural factors. Violence is not inevitable. It's a product of the interaction between our biology and our environment. When the context changes with better education support and social norms, the expression of violence drops dramatically, even if the biology stays the same. And this brings us to what might be the most overlooked piece of the puzzle. What no one seems to be talking about is this: men, on average, have weaker social and emotional support networks, and this has measurable destructive effects. Studies consistently show that men report having fewer close friends and less emotional support than women. They are less likely to seek help for stress or depression. They often replace feelings of sadness, fear, or loneliness with anger or withdrawal because that's what they've been taught is acceptable. A massive, decades-long Harvard study found that emotionally isolated men have higher levels of stress or impulsivity and a risk of early death comparable to smoking. There's a direct link between this isolation and aggression. When someone lacks social support, the part of their brain that controls emotions gets overwhelmed by chronic stress. The fight-or-flight response is more easily triggered. This makes a person more reactive and impulsive. In men, this is culturally reinforced. They're told to suck it up and not show weakness. So stress doesn't get talked out, it gets acted out as irritability, anger, isolation, or violence. Why does this happen? It's rooted in traditional male socialization. Be strong, don't cry, solve it yourself. Boys are often not encouraged to develop emotional literacy. Their friendships tend to be built around activities, not sharing feelings. And many men rely almost exclusively on their partner for emotional support, so when a relationship ends, they become completely isolated. So yes, men often live with less emotional and social support. This increases their stress and impulsivity, making them more vulnerable to acting out violently against others or themselves. This isn't an excuse, but it is a critical piece of the explanation. Recognizing these statistical trends and social conditions doesn't mean we re-excusing bad behavior or casting men as helpless victims. At the end of the day, there is always choice and personal responsibility. There are two layers to this. First, the structural layer. Yes, biology, culture, and social pressure create tendencies and probabilities. They might push, but they don't dictate. The capacity for self-control, empathy, and reflection is a human capacity, not a gendered one. And that leads to the individual layer, our choices and values. This is where personal responsibility comes in. A man can grow up in a violent environment, but decide not to repeat the pattern. He can feel intense anger, but learn to channel it into something constructive. He can be taught to stay silent, but choose to ask for help when he needs it. These choices are what separate instinct from character. True strength isn't denying our nature, it's understanding it and acting with conscious awareness. So, the synthesis is this: men are statistically more at risk of violent behavior. They also suffer from more emotional pressure and loneliness, but they are not passive victims of their biology or their circumstances. True maturity lies in recognizing the forces that influence us, but refusing to be defined by them. It's about making conscious choices to be better. Thanks for watching. If this conversation resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into topics that matter.